The 3040 passengers on Emirates Flight 447 were worried when they noticed a change in the engine noise, but the blonde woman in the back seat of economy class had heard it before, because it marked the line between life and death, and she had crossed it many times. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoyed this story about those who serve in silence, please consider subscribing for more tales of unsung heroes. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her reading glasses and turned the page of her paperback novel the same way she had done countless times during the 6-hour flight from Dubai to London. To the businessman in 23B, she appeared to be exactly what her boarding pass suggested, a middle-aged woman traveling economy class, probably returning from a vacation or business trip. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore comfortable jeans and a plain blue sweater, and her only luggage was a small carry-on bag that she had placed carefully in the overhead compartment. The other passengers on Emirates Flight 447 had barely noticed her during boarding. She hadn't drawn attention to herself, hadn't complained about the cramped seating, and hadn't engaged in small talk with her neighbors. Sarah had simply settled into seat 23A, buckled her seatbelt, and opened her book, giving every appearance of being a routine traveler on a routine flight. What none of the 340 passengers and crew members aboard the wide-body aircraft knew was that Sarah Mitchell was far from ordinary. For 15 years, she had served as one of the world's most elite test pilots, flying experimental aircraft that pushed the boundaries of aviation technology and human endurance. She had piloted prototypes that most people would never see, tested systems that would eventually save thousands of lives, and survived situations that would have killed lesser pilots. Sarah's career had taken her to the edge of space and back, through atmospheric conditions that existed nowhere else on Earth, and into scenarios where split-second decisions meant the difference between successful completion of a test program and catastrophic failure. She had flown aircraft that existed only as blueprints, engines that had never been proven, and navigation systems that were purely theoretical until she proved they could work in real-world conditions. Her expertise encompassed not just piloting skills, but deep understanding of aerodynamics, mechanical systems, emergency procedures, and crisis management that went far beyond what commercial pilots typically learned. Sarah had been trained to think and react in situations where standard operating procedures didn't exist, where innovation and intuition were the only tools available for survival. The decision to retire from test flying hadn't been easy, but after a near-fatal accident during the testing of an experimental supersonic transport, Sarah had decided that 15 years of pushing the envelope was enough. She had transitioned to a consulting role with aerospace manufacturers, using her experience to improve safety protocols and training procedures for the next generation of test pilots. This flight to London was part of her new life, traveling to meetings and conferences where she shared her knowledge without the physical risks that had defined her career for so long. Sarah had chosen economy class not because she couldn't afford better, but because she valued the anonymity it provided. In business or first class, fellow passengers might try to engage her in conversation, and she had grown tired of explaining her background or deflecting questions about her work. The book in her lap was a thriller about international espionage, chosen specifically because it was completely unrelated to aviation and allowed her mind to relax during the long flight. Sarah had learned that the best way to decompress from the intensity of her professional life was to immerse herself in stories that had nothing to do with aircraft, altitude, or technical systems. But even in retirement from active test flying, Sarah's senses remained finely tuned to the subtle variations in aircraft performance that most passengers would never notice. She could feel changes in engine rhythm, variations in cabin pressure, and shifts in flight attitude that her years of experience had trained her to recognize immediately. 3 hours into the flight, as the aircraft cruised at 37,000 feet over the Mediterranean Sea, Sarah noticed the first sign that something was amiss. The subtle change in engine noise was barely perceptible. A slight variation in the harmonic frequency that indicated one of the turbofan engines was experiencing irregular combustion. It wasn't immediately dangerous, but it was the kind of anomaly that could develop into a serious problem if not addressed properly. Sarah glanced around the cabin to see if any other passengers had noticed the change. The businessman beside her continued typing on his laptop. The family across the aisle was watching in-flight entertainment, and the flight attendants were serving drinks with their usual professional efficiency. No one else seemed aware that anything was different. For several minutes, Sarah monitored the subtle changes in aircraft performance while maintaining the appearance of reading her book. Her trained ear detected slight variations in engine output, minor adjustments in flight attitude, and the almost imperceptible increase in vibration that suggested the flight crew was dealing with a developing mechanical issue. The first official indication of trouble came when the seatbelt sign illuminated unexpectedly, followed by the captain's voice over the intercom requesting that all passengers return to their seats and fasten their seatbelts due to unexpected turbulence. Sarah knew immediately that this wasn't about weather conditions. The sky outside was clear, and the aircraft's movement patterns were consistent with mechanical problems rather than atmospheric disturbances. As the minutes passed, the engine noise irregularities became more pronounced, and Sarah could feel the subtle changes in aircraft performance that indicated the crew was likely dealing with a partial engine failure. The aircraft was still flying normally, but she recognized the signs of a developing emergency that would require immediate attention and expert handling. 20 minutes after the initial seatbelt announcement, the captain's voice returned to the intercom, this time with a more serious tone. He announced that the aircraft was experiencing a minor technical issue and would need to divert to the nearest suitable airport for a precautionary landing. He assured passengers that there was no immediate danger and that the crew was following standard procedures for this type of situation. Sarah knew that the captain's calm demeanor was designed to prevent panic among the passengers, but her experience told her that the situation was likely more serious than being described. The increasingly irregular engine performance and the aircraft's subtle but noticeable loss of altitude suggested that they were dealing with a significant mechanical failure that would require expert crisis management. As the crew began preparing the cabin for an emergency landing, Sarah noticed signs of stress among the flight attendants that confirmed her assessment of the situation's severity. Their movements were more hurried than usual, their responses to passenger questions were more scripted, and their coordination suggested they were following emergency protocols rather than routine procedures. The aircraft's continued descent and the increasingly erratic engine performance told Sarah that they were dealing with more than a minor technical issue. Her test pilot experience had taught her to recognize the signs of catastrophic mechanical failure, and what she was feeling and hearing suggested that this flight was in serious trouble. When the oxygen masks suddenly deployed and the captain announced that passengers should prepare for an emergency landing, Sarah knew that the situation had escalated beyond standard emergency procedures. The deployment of emergency oxygen suggested rapid decompression or preparation for emergency descent, both scenarios that required immediate expert intervention. As chaos erupted in the cabin, with passengers crying, praying, and struggling with their oxygen masks, Sarah made a decision that would reveal her true identity and potentially save hundreds of lives. She unbuckled her seatbelt, stood up, and began making her way toward the front of the aircraft, moving with the confident purposefulness of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. The flight attendants initially tried to direct her back to her seat, following standard emergency procedures that required all passengers to remain seated during emergency situations. But Sarah's demeanor and obvious knowledge of aircraft emergency procedures made them hesitate, and when she identified herself as a licensed commercial pilot, they allowed her to continue toward the cockpit. At the cockpit door, Sarah knocked and called out her qualifications, identifying herself as Captain Sarah Mitchell, a former test pilot with 15 years of experience in experimental aircraft and emergency procedures. The response from inside was immediate, as the flight crew recognized that they might need assistance from someone with her level of expertise. The scene inside the cockpit confirmed Sarah's worst fears about the severity of their situation. Multiple warning lights illuminated the instrument panel, indicating failures in both engines, hydraulic systems, and flight control mechanisms. The aircraft was effectively flying on backup systems that were designed for short-term emergency use, not for sustained flight operations. Captain Rodriguez, the flight's commander, quickly briefed Sarah on their situation. They had experienced cascading system failures that began with engine problems but had spread to multiple aircraft systems. They were losing altitude, had limited control authority, and were attempting to reach the nearest airport for an emergency landing that would test the limits of both the aircraft and their flying skills. Sarah's test pilot experience immediately proved invaluable, as she recognized failure patterns that were similar to situations she had encountered during experimental flight testing. Her knowledge of backup systems, emergency procedures, and crisis management provided the crew with options and techniques that weren't covered in standard commercial aviation training. Working together, Sarah and the flight crew developed an approach strategy that utilized her experience with flying damaged aircraft and the crew's knowledge of this specific aircraft type. Her expertise in flying unstable aircraft provided crucial insights into managing the control inputs needed to maintain flight with compromised systems. The emergency descent required precise coordination between Sarah's knowledge of experimental flight techniques and the crew's understanding of standard emergency procedures. Her experience with test-flying aircraft that had never been proven to work properly was directly applicable to flying a commercial aircraft that was no longer functioning within normal parameters. As they approached their emergency landing airport, Sarah's expertise became even more critical. The aircraft's damaged systems required flying techniques that went beyond standard pilot training, demanding the kind of innovative problem-solving that defined test pilot work. Her ability to think beyond standard procedures and develop real-time solutions was exactly what the situation required. The landing itself was a testament to the value of having someone with Sarah's unique background aboard during a crisis. Her knowledge of flying damaged aircraft, combined with the crew's professional skills and the aircraft's backup systems, enabled them to execute an emergency landing that brought all 340 passengers and crew members safely to the ground. After the successful emergency landing and the evacuation of all passengers, the full extent of the aircraft's mechanical failures became apparent. Investigators later determined that the cascading system failures should have resulted in the complete loss of the aircraft, and that the successful landing was only possible because of the extraordinary flying skills and crisis management expertise that Sarah brought to the situation. The airline industry took note of the incident, not just as an example of successful crisis management, but as validation of the value that test pilot experience could bring to commercial aviation emergency situations. Sarah's background in flying experimental aircraft and managing unprecedented technical failures had provided capabilities that weren't available through standard commercial pilot training. For Sarah, the incident represented an unexpected return to the high-stakes decision-making that had defined her test pilot career. Although she had retired from actively testing experimental aircraft, her expertise had proven to be exactly what was needed when a routine commercial flight became a life-threatening emergency. The passengers, who had barely noticed the quiet woman in seat 23A, learned that their lives had been saved by one of the world's most experienced test pilots, someone whose background in pushing the boundaries of aviation had prepared her to handle situations that were beyond the scope of normal flight operations. Media coverage of the incident focused on the dramatic emergency landing and the successful rescue of all passengers, but Sarah declined most interview requests, preferring to maintain the same low profile that had characterized her approach to the original flight. She had never sought recognition for her test pilot work, and she wasn't interested in fame for doing what her training and experience had prepared her to do. The aviation industry, however, recognized the significance of what had happened aboard Emirates Flight 447. Sarah's intervention had not only saved lives, but had demonstrated the value of having highly experienced pilots available during crisis situations, leading to discussions about how airlines might better utilize retired test pilots and military aviators in emergency consulting roles. For the passengers and crew who experienced the emergency, Sarah Mitchell became a symbol of the hidden expertise that exists among ordinary travelers. Her willingness to step forward during a crisis, combined with her extraordinary qualifications, had transformed what could have been a tragedy into a testament to human capability and professional dedication. Years later, when asked about the incident, Sarah would say that her test pilot training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation, where standard procedures weren't sufficient and innovative problem-solving was required for survival. She had spent 15 years learning to fly aircraft that weren't supposed to work, and that experience had proven invaluable when she needed to help fly a commercial aircraft that had stopped working properly. The story of Emirates Flight 447 became a case study in aviation circles, demonstrating how the right expertise, applied at the right moment, could mean the difference between tragedy and triumph. Sarah's background as a test pilot had given her the knowledge and skills needed to handle a situation that would have overwhelmed conventional training and procedures. Captain Sarah Mitchell had proven that retirement from active flying didn't mean retirement from the aviation community, and that the expertise gained through years of test pilot work could continue to serve aviation safety in unexpected ways. Her quiet presence in seat 23A had been exactly what Flight 447 needed when routine procedures weren't enough to ensure survival. The incident reminded everyone involved that heroism often comes in unexpected forms, and that the most valuable expertise is sometimes carried by those who make no effort to advertise their capabilities. Sarah's willingness to act when her skills were needed, combined with her professional competence in crisis situations, had saved hundreds of lives and demonstrated the continuing value of test pilot experience in commercial aviation. Her story became an inspiration to pilots, passengers, and aviation professionals, proving that experience, expertise, and the willingness to act when others needed help could transform an ordinary flight into an extraordinary example of human capability and professional dedication.